Okay, so
You can put it like horizontal here, everyone.
yeah, I'll turn that later. The point is to turn it. Anyway, so hi everyone and welcome to Dr. Malpas's talk. It's going to be on Donald Davidson's analytic hermeneutics, as was stipulated in the flyer. So I will do a quick introduction of Dr. Malpas. So Dr. Malpas is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Tasmania, a distinguished visiting professor at LaTrobe University, an honorary professor at the University of Queensland, a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, and a distinguished fellow and vice president of the Australian Association of von Humboldt Fellows. So in today's talk on Donald Davidson's analytic hermeneutics, Dr. Malpas will discuss from theory of meaning to topology of understanding. Did I get everything right there, Dr. Malpas?
Probably, but you do want me to do 3 lectures, don't you?
Yes, this is the first one, first of a series of
This is the first one. So we won't get to topology of understanding today.
Okay, right. So we'll get to something and you're in charge from now on. Great.
All right. Well, thank you, Emil. Thank you for inviting me to do this. I hope you can see me okay. We're in the process of settling into a new house, so it seemed better to do it out here on the veranda rather than in a house that's in something of a state of disarray. So what I'm going to do is share my screen in just a moment, and you'll still be able to see me in a corner of the screen, but you'll be able to see some PowerPoint images as well. So let's go. Oh, the host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, no.
Emil, can you enable participant screen sharing?
Can you do that for me? You're the IT guy.
I'm not the IT. I have no idea.
How do you enable screen sharing other than the host?
In Zoom?
Yeah, in Zoom.
No clue.
Yeah. You do?
Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Try now.
Yep, it works.
Works.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, just in time.
Oh, hang on. No, sorry. No, I've just got to go back last because I want to do it in a slightly different way.
Wanted to join online.
Can you just
hang
take
on.
over? Just take over. I don't know. I've never used Zoom before.
No, hang on. I'm going to disable screen sharing for a moment while I inadvertently hit the wrong button there. Ah, there we go. Stop sharing. Okay, so we'll try again. Share screen. We want advanced, and then we want PowerPoint as a virtual background.
Is that enabled everybody?
And
yeah.
Last. I'm just going to have to go back and put my PowerPoint presentation on the desktop. This PC. Sorry about this. I hadn't expected it to do this. Okay. Now, hopefully that will enable me to do what we want to do. So, PowerPoint is virtual background. Desktop. Davidson. I'm hoping this is going to work. Yep. Okay. All right. So this is I find this quite a useful way of doing it because it means you can still see me, but you can also see my slides. I think it's always awful when you have somebody talking to you and all you can see is their slides, but you can't see the person. So what I'm going to do is take you over the next couple of weeks or so over across 3 different lectures. And the overall arc of these lectures is going to be from theory of meaning to topology of understanding. And it's going to cover most of Donald Davidson's thinking, from the thinking in the early period to the later material. And so lecture 1 will focus on Davidson's early work, primarily in the 1960s to 1980s. And it really covers issues in action, in mind, and meaning. The second lecture is going to focus on Davidson's later thinking, primarily in the 1980s to the 2000s, particularly in the 1990s. And the issues there are going to primarily be issues of knowledge, truth, and language, although there'll be some overlap between both of these sections. And I'll be talking in these two sections about quite a wide range of different material. But as I hope you'll see, one of the features of Davidson's thinking is that it tends to be highly integrated, even though it appears in somewhat piecemeal fashion. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And the third lecture is going to focus on Davidson in a wider context. And that's going to connect Davidson not just with other developments in analytic philosophy, but also with hermeneutics, particularly with Gadamer, but also with Heidegger, which has been an area or a point of comparison that's been quite important in a lot of my work, and connecting Davidson with what I call philosophical topology. So I've tried to read Davidson along with Heidegger and to a lesser extent Gadamer as characteristic of a mode of philosophy that takes place as a central concept. In Davidson's case, implicitly more so than explicitly. And that will be the focus for lecture 3. So lecture 3 will really be pushing the boundaries, if you like, of the reading of Davidson in a slightly different, well, quite a different direction from that which you'll find in most of the standard analytic literature anyway. I want to say a little bit about Don, first of all. So I got to know Don Davidson very well. I used to visit Berkeley every year from about, I guess, from the early 1990s onwards. So I knew Davidson very well for the last decade of his life. And that was quite an important period because it was the period when Davidson was probably elaborating his ideas in ways that were quite often seen as quite radically distinct from the ideas that had been central earlier on. So he was looking at the larger consequences of his thinking. Now Davidson, just to give you a bit of an outline of his life, I'll come back to the screen in a moment. He was born in 1917 in Springfield, Massachusetts. His father actually was in the steel industry, and Don liked to tell the story of his first job being as a cabin boy on board a ship carrying steel from the east coast of America to the west coast, to San Francisco. And in fact, the steel they were carrying was steel for the Golden Gate Bridge. So Don used to say that one of the things he always enjoyed when he went across the Golden Gate was the thought that some of that bridge he had brought for the construction. He originally studied not philosophy, but literature and classics. This was at Harvard in the US, and became something of a favorite student of A.N. Whitehead, who was at Harvard at the time. And most of you, I'm hoping, would know who A.N. Whitehead was, very important as the founder of so-called process philosophy. Very much focused, however, on the history of philosophy. And Davidson's early work was primarily, or early interest was primarily in the history of ideas, more so than in straight philosophy. He completed his undergraduate study. He then headed out west. As he used to tell the story, he had a girlfriend whose father was in Hollywood. So they went out to California, and Don had some idea that he would be able to make a career for himself writing radio scripts. And he wrote and sold one script, I think, which he thought was quite a success. But actually, he says he spent most of the time with his girlfriend riding on horseback around parts of Hollywood at a time when they were still filming cowboy movies in those areas, because it was still fairly open. He said he used to watch cowboy movies and find that he was familiar with some of the areas where they were filming. But while he was out there, he wasn't successful as a script writer. But while he was out there, he got offered a fellowship, a scholarship back at Harvard. The only complication was it wasn't in literature, it wasn't in philosophy, it was in classics, and it was under Werner Jaeger, the very famous classic German classical scholar. So Don decided nothing much was happening in script writing, so he came back to the East Coast. He's enrolled at Harvard to do a PhD in classics. He became Werner Jaeger's assistant, which itself came with some interesting complications. Don said he wondered why he was always being left alone after dinner at the Jaegers with the Jaegers' daughter. And he soon realized that Werner's idea was that Don was going to succeed him in the way that German professors, German professorial students did in those days. That is, take over the family business, as it were, by marrying the daughter. However, in the meantime, Don also got to know W.V.O. Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine, who at the time was becoming an influential figure in American philosophy. His studies were interrupted by the war. He wanted to join the Air Force, and Don always enjoyed flying, but his eyesight wasn't the best. He tried to get around this by memorizing all of the test sheets that the Air Force doctors or medical guys used. Luckily, one of them picked up that he couldn't see very well. And instead of being a pilot, he became basically an Air Force liaison officer with the Navy, and he was responsible for aircraft observation and identification. So he served with the US Navy during World War II, primarily in the Mediterranean, and after the war came back, completed his dissertation at Harvard, a dissertation which was still sort of in classics. It was actually on Plato's Philebus, completed that in 1949, and incidentally, the topic of his dissertation was the same topic as Govin's dissertation, doctoral dissertation. I think it was his doctoral dissertation. It may have been his habilitation, actually. And that becomes a point of connection with Govin later on. He has his first position as a teaching position at Queens College in New York, and then soon gets a position at Stanford and holds a succession of fairly prestigious positions after Stanford. In fact, there's one paper that we'll be talking about shortly that really establishes Davidson's reputation and enabled him to pick and choose where he wanted to go after Stanford. So he was at Stanford, then at Chicago, Rockefeller University, a private university, and then finally UC Berkeley, which is where he was until he died. He was married 3 times, and his last wife was Marcia Cavell, who is also a philosopher with an interest in psychoanalysis, which had a direct influence on some of Davidson's later work. And Marcia is still living now in New York. And Don's death was quite sudden. He was in his 80s. We all thought he was going to live on, well into his 90s. But he was also very active, and he loved skiing. He had a bad knee, decided really he wanted to be able to ski again, and the knee operation didn't go so well. Although, depending which medical expert you talk to, it may be that the complications of the knee surgery weren't just about the knee surgery. So that's a little bit about Davidson's life. Some people tend to assume that analytic philosophers have a fairly narrow set of interests. Davidson's interests were quite large. He was an avid hiker. When he was younger, he loved flying. He was a glider pilot. He was deeply interested in all things scientific. He used to read scientific papers assiduously. But he was also very knowledgeable about literature and about the classics. Oddly enough, one of the first times we had dinner with the Davidsons, Bert Dreyfus was also invited, mainly because, for various reasons. And Bert and I were having an argument about Greek mythology. And I asked Don his opinion. And Don was able to basically cite chapter and verse from Aeschylus and from the tragedies and wherever else was relevant to Bert Dreyfus's amazement. So I think some of this is, although it might seem like just the incidental details of life, it's relevant, I think, to understanding Davidson's work, partly because that breadth of interest is reflected in his writing. He writes on topics from standard philosophical topics, but he also writes on James Joyce. He writes on all sorts of things. He was deeply interested in music. He played piano. In fact, he and Marcia had 2 baby grand pianos in the house in Berkeley, and they used to play duets. He marked, examined music dissertations. he was deeply interested in politics. And so he's somebody who he's maybe not the Renaissance man. He has very wide interests and capacities. Now, let me just go back to the slide I had before, because it's worth having a look at or being aware of Davidson's publications. So up until the early 1980s, all of his publications were in the form of essays. In the early 1980s, 1980 and 1980, we should have 1984, that's right, 2 volumes came out which collected together most of the important essays that Davidson had published over the previous 10 to 15 years. These were incredibly important and influential collections, and they included papers that had made huge changes within analytic philosophy and during the time in which they were published. And they're the 2 volumes, Essays on Actions and Events and Inquiries into Truth and Interpretation. When I was a postgraduate and I was working on Davidson, they were pretty much my Bibles, particularly Inquiries into Truth and Interpretation. My PhD was actually pretty much on Davidson, but with a strong orientation to Gardner and focused on theories of truth and interpretation. His first book, Decision-Making Experimental Approach, was one he wrote at Stanford with Pat Suppies. And it was an interesting book because it came out of experimental work that Davidson, Suppies, and Siegel did in decision theory. And Don always used to say, half jokingly, that what that work demonstrated to him was the poverty of work in experimental psychology, or at least its deeply problematic nature. It's a useful book to be aware of because a couple of things come out of that are relevant to Davidson's later thinking. One is the interdependence of belief and desire, which he and Pat Suppies were really testing out studying gambling behavior, in which, as it were, the bets that people are making and the probabilities that they assign to the outcomes related to those bets can be seen as ways of mapping a certain belief design matrix. The other idea that comes out of that early book is something that Davidson came to realize and became very important in his thinking, and that was when one is communicating with the subject in an experimental situation, one of the difficulties is knowing how the subject is understanding what you tell them. And you cannot assume that they understand you in the way that you intend. This picks up on ideas that have become quite common in philosophy of language, particularly associated with Paul Grice, around issues of speaker meaning, of intention in meaning, and so on. But it means that Davidson came to the view that communication is not a matter of simply getting at some preordained meaning that either speaker or hearer already are acquainted with, but a much more interactive and often indeterminate process. Now, the other books that are listed there, Subjective, Objective, Intersubjective, Objective, which is mistakenly written there as 1984, it's actually 2001. Subjective, Intersubjective, Objective, Problems of Rationality, Truth, Language, and History are the 3 volumes that collect together the essays that Davidson wrote primarily in the late 1980s and 1990s and into the early 2000s. And some of the essays in those volumes really extend and expand Davidson's thinking in new directions in some cases, but in directions that are still continuous with the older direction that's evident in the 2 early volumes. Truth and Predication is essentially Davidson's last book and the only book he wrote as a book. It's based on the Dewey lectures that he had given in the 1990s, and it really tries to address what seems like a very specific problem, namely, what is the unity of the proposition? How are subject and predicate related? It's an old problem, one that Davidson identifies back in Plato and that runs through much of Western philosophy, at least philosophy of language. And it sets out an account of predication that draws on Davidson's earlier work in the philosophy of language and semantic theory. So that's just a bit of an outline of Davidson's main publications. I've left out the specific essays, but those essays are now mostly collected together in these volumes, in the first two volumes from the 1980s and in the more recent volumes from the 2000s. So if I was to direct you to just 2 or 3 of those volumes, I would say that probably, first of all, subjective, intersubjective, and objective is probably the single most important in terms of giving you access to Davidson's later thinking. And then secondarily, essays on actions and events and inquiries into truth and interpretation. That's not to say there aren't important things in the other volumes, but those 3 are probably the most important. So what I'm going to do today is really focus on 3 topics in Davidson's early work. Remember, I said that we're going to have 3 lectures here. Lecture 1 is going to be on the early work from the 1960s to 1980s. And I'm going to be begin by talking a bit about Davidson's work in the philosophy of action. We'll then talk a little bit about his work in the theory of meaning, semantic theory. And then we'll finish up with a little bit of discussion of his work in philosophy of mind. And there are specific essays that are relevant to each of those topics. And if we've got time, I'll try and say a little bit about something else known as radical interpretation, although that may well be something that we hold over till the second lecture. So let me begin by talking about Davidson's first major publication. In 1963, he publishes, this isn't his very first essay. His first published work, apart from some very minor publications, is actually an essay on Rudolf Carnap that appears in the Library of Living Philosophers volume dedicated to Carnap. But Davidson tended not to put much weight on that essay. It was written for the Carnap volume. Davidson got it included due to Quine's good offices. So Actions, Reasons and Causes is not only his first major essay, but it's also the essay that really made his name. It's an incredibly important and influential essay in the history of 20th century philosophy. And I should say, by the way, that I'm not sure how many of you have heard of Davidson before I started talking, but Davidson, in my view, is probably, arguably with Quine, one of the most important and influential thinkers of the second half of the 20th century in English language philosophy. Certainly in the 1970s and late 1960s, he was the preeminent philosopher in English, in analytic philosophy. So Davidson's a very, very important figure. And yet, he's not as well known as many other figures. And that's partly because Davidson, in some ways, was a much more, not exactly a technical philosopher, but he wrote primarily essays, as I've noted before. His work was not easy to access, so it never had any popular impact. And to really engage with Davidson, you have to do quite a bit of work, which isn't to say that plenty of people haven't tried to show that Davidson's positions and ideas are silly, because in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, he was the philosopher that budding academics would like to tangle with by writing some piece that shows Davidson is clearly wrong. Usually those pieces didn't depend on particularly good readings of Davidson, but he was probably the philosopher who attracted most attention during those years and still attracts attention. So Actions, Reasons and Causes tries to address the question of the relation between reasons and causes in the explanation of action. The focus is on the explanation of action. And it's the context, the larger context in which it appears, is one in which Davidson is really addressing a set of problems that come out of Ludwig Wittgenstein's work. Now, Davidson had spent much of the years immediately preceding the late 50s and early 60s in Oxford during periods of leave, engaging with Wittgensteinian influenced philosophers, and in particular with Elizabeth Anscombe. And Anscombe had written a very influential little book called Intention, which appeared in quite an important series, the so-called Red volumes or Red books that Routledge published. which included not only Anscombe's Intention, but other books, included Peter Winch's book on the very idea of a social science. So Davidson wrote this essay in a Wittgensteinian context. Interestingly, the essay is often taken as an anti-Wittgensteinian piece, but in fact that's not correct. Davidson wrote this in the spirit of Wittgenstein, even though he was also taking issue with at least one Wittgensteinian idea. So Wittgenstein, when it came to action explanation, had the view that rational explanation by reference to reasons, is the way in which we explain actions or intentional actions, and that rational explanations are a sui generis type of explanation. That is, they are a species of explanation that stand on their own. They're not the same as the explanations that we use elsewhere. And in particular, they're not causal explanations. So for Wittgenstein, rational explanation and causal explanation are two quite different things. Now, this is actually a view that to some extent gets picked up by people like Peter Winch. It's a view that you can see already picking up on older discussions, particularly in German philosophy, about the nature of historical explanation, which very often draws on action explanatory frameworks. So Davidson is often seen as going against this Wittgensteinian position. And the Wittgensteinian position was more or less the orthodox position at the time. So Wittgenstein, that position held that reasons were not causes. In Actions, Reasons and Causes, Davidson argues exactly the opposite. He argues that reasons are causes. And his argument in some ways is quite simple. It's that if reasons are causes, if reasons are explanatory, then they can only be explanatory if they have some causal relationship to the action. Okay, and that this is in fact reflected in the way we talk about reasons. We ask, why did so-and-so do X? And we say, because he thought that, or because she believed that, or because she wanted that. So the typical form of an action explanation is that we show an action to make sense, if you like, through showing how it is brought about by what we might think of as something to do with the psychological state of the agent, but more specifically by reference to beliefs and desires that the agent has. Now, Davidson calls the combination of belief and desire a pro-attitude. Together, it constitutes a reason. Okay? And Davidson wants to say the only way of making sense of its capacity to explain is by saying that it causes. But here's the twist, and this is where you can see that Davidson is also trying to accommodate the basic Wittgensteinian idea that reasons and causes aren't quite the same, and that is that Davidson will say that reasons are causes, but that they're not identical with causes. Not every cause is a reason. And the way in which reasons explain action is through there being a causal connection, but that causal connection only operates under or can only be discerned under certain descriptions of the action. And this idea, you'll see, I talk about there being two key ideas. I should have said three key ideas. One is that actions are explained by their being embedded in a rational framework. That's the Wittgensteinian idea. And that means for Davidson that they're understood in terms of reasons and desires, the belief-desire. That notion, the belief-desire model, is often contested by contemporary Wittgensteinians, although they often take a rather narrow reading of what that implies in the Davidsonian case. Secondly, reasons are causes, but not all causes are reasons. And thirdly, all action is action under a description, which means that the same action may have different descriptions, and under some descriptions it may not appear as an action at all. Now, that third idea, that all action is action under a description, Davidson takes directly from Anscombe. So Anscombe introduces this idea that if we're going to think about actions, and if we're going to think about them as rational, we have to understand them under the right descriptions. Some actions under other descriptions do not appear as rational at all. So, for instance, if you refer to the example that Davidson uses is flicking a light switch and thereby alerting a burglar who's in the house. Now, the flicking of the light switch is an intentional description. It's an action. The flipping of the light switch turns out to be accidentally identical with alerting the burglar to your presence, right? Now, under one description, namely flicking the light switch, I want light to be able to see, that action is a rational action. It's an intentional action. But under another description, alerting the prowler, it's not an intentional action. And you might say it doesn't have a rational explanation. I don't intend to alert the prowler. That's something that happens independently. You can think of other examples too. You can think of, or other ways of reading that example. So this idea of action under a description turns out to be quite important because what it shows us, if you like, is that rational explanation is always sensitive to the context in which the explanation is offered or in which the explanation seems to be required. So the explanation has to be relevant to the descriptive framework in which we're working. Now, these ideas about actions, reasons, and causes become quite important in Davidson's later thinking. Not only do you have here a connection between belief and desire, which is a connection that Davidson had already started being interested in as a result of his work on decision theory, but you also get this idea that, if you like, rationality is a matter of connection between attitudes or between states, however you want to put it. And so we understand something as rational, not by simply identifying a specific sort of reason as belonging to it, but rather by seeing that it is embedded within a structure of connectivity that connects other beliefs and desires, that connects it with a body of reasons, if you like. Now, this idea becomes quite important in other ways to Davidson later on, because it's elaborated later on in terms of a thoroughly holistic conception of what we might think of as mental content. So that for Davidson, you never just have one belief, you never just have one desire. If you have one belief, you have many beliefs. If you have one desire, you have lots of desires. And if you have desires, you've got to have beliefs and vice versa. And if you have beliefs and desires, then the whole lot of other attitudes you've got to have as well. They all have to be embedded within a larger structure. And that structure is pretty much what Davidson understands as the structure of rationality. Rationality here, it should be added, is a fairly thin concept for Davidson. I use that language of a thin concept in the Rawlsian sense. It's not a concept of rationality that fills that concept out in a lot of detail that restricts it in certain ways. It's a very minimalist concept. It's just this idea that something is rational if it is sufficiently connected with other beliefs, other attitudes, other rational states, as it were. So now that first essay on actions, reasons, and causes, and if you've never read Davidson, that's probably not a bad essay to begin with because it's reasonably accessible and it's quite important for the later thinking. That essay has within it lots of elements that get picked up or developed in other ways later on. And it's also the essay that establishes Davidson's reputation, as I said earlier. It can be said too to inaugurate Davidson's interest in action, an interest that continues through a great deal of his thinking and that ramifies into an interest in, for instance, weakness of will, into an interest in irrationality as well as rationality, and that to some extent also connects up with the interest in philosophical psychology and psychoanalysis that he develops later on, partly under Marcia Cavell's influence. Okay, so action, philosophy of action is one of the important areas where Davidson makes a significant contribution. By the late 60s, however, Davidson, and you might say that he, certainly when I studied philosophy of action as an undergraduate in the 1980s, Davidson was one of the key figures. You couldn't do philosophy of action without reading Davidson. But there's another area in which Davidson became even more influential and important, and that's within semantic theory, the theory of meaning. And that's what I want to talk about next. So the key paper, the earliest paper here, is probably Truth and Meaning from 1967. Now, in that paper, Davidson aims to connect meaning with truth. So if you like, Davidson's idea, theory of meaning is a long-standing area of philosophical inquiry, particularly in the 60s. It's really concerns the attempt to provide an analysis or an account of what meaning is. How should meaning be analysed in particular? Now, in Truth and Meaning, Davidson sets out an argument to the effect that we can understand meaning best by looking to truth. But he does that in a particular way. His approach is a truth conditional approach, which means that he takes meaning to be identical with truth conditions. What are truth conditions? Well, they're the conditions under which a sentence is true. So if we say, if I use the sentence snow is white, and I utter that sentence now, then that sentence is made true by it being the case that snow is white. Okay, it being true that snow is white. Now that idea is the key to Davidson's thinking about meaning. His thinking about meaning has three main elements, three main components. The first is semantic holism. So Davidson holds that a theory of meaning, an adequate theory of meaning, must be capable of giving the meaning for any sentence in a way that's adequate for all sentences. So we might also say the meaning of any one sentence is always going to be dependent on the meaning of other sentences. Meaning, in other words, is a holistic idea. It's always a matter of the position of the sentence in the entire language, not the sentence taken on its own. So semantic holism is, if you like, one of the requirements Davidson sets for an adequate theory of meaning. The second is compositionality. Compositionality is a really simple idea, but quite important. And it's based in the observation that genuine languages, natural languages, are capable of infinite extension. You can continue generating new sentences forever. Okay? And yet, if that language is going to be learnable, it has to be based on a finite set of axioms. And in fact, one of Davidson's early papers is on theories of meaning and learnable languages, focused on the problem of the learnability of language. Now, so if the meaning of a language is dependent on a finite set of axioms, then we can say that the theory of meaning also has to reflect that. And that means that essentially the theory must be capable of generating all of the possible sentences that are possible in a language, which is infinite. But it has to do that on the basis of finite resources. And that would seem to be true just on the basis of observing the human capacity for language. We have finite capacity, but we can say an infinite number of things, potentially. Most of it, we don't have the lifespan to be able to. We're mortal, so we can only ever say a finite number, but potentially the number of utterances possible in language are infinite. So compositionality is another requirement. And compositionality, putting it in terms of compositionality, is just the idea that you generate, you make up sentences, new sentences on the basis of the finite resources that you already have. Okay? Now, the third requirement is extensionality, which is something I've already effectively referred to. And that is the theory of meaning has to be based not in relations between particular sentences and something called a meaning, but between sentences and other sentences. And you can see how extensionality is directly connected to semantic holism. Both of them are really holistic sorts of requirements. Extensionality is interesting, though, because what it does is reject the idea that meaning is some sort of almost a metaphysical entity. And it's really a continuation of the Quinean claim that a rejection with Quine, what Quine called the museum myth of meaning. as if meanings were objects that sat in a museum or in some place, such that they had a discrete character. They were like objects, and they were apart from sentences. Davidson doesn't think there are such things. Later on, that emphasis on extensionality is going to extend further, and David's going to say that there are only sentences. There is not such a thing as a proposition distinct from a sentence. And that's quite an important move. And the importance of that, I think, will become evident when we talk later on about Davidson's view of truth. So Davidson's strategy in developing the theory of meaning is very specific. And I just want to say a little bit about this. I'm not going to go into too much of the detail here. We get involved in some issues about basic first order logic at certain points, but we don't need to go into the formalisms involved. Davidson's argument for the form that a theory of meaning has to take, and he thinks that a theory of meaning is going to have a very specific form, is as follows. He begins with just a very ordinary claim that a theory of meaning ought to be able to generate theorems that have the form S means that P, okay? Where S names an object language sentence and P names a meta language sentence. So you work with the idea basically that your theory of meaning has to be in a language, but it's a theory of meaning about a language. And so what you're doing is connecting up sentences in the language for which you want a theory of meaning with sentences in another language, a larger framework language that specifies the meaning. Hence, S means that P. Now, Davidson suggests that, well, if we take meaning to be equivalent to truth conditions, then we can take that sentence A, S means that P, to be equivalent to another sentence, S is true if and only if P. And we need the if and only if because we need equivalence of truth values on each side. Famous example that Davidson uses is Schnee ist weiß, if and only if snow is white. Schnee ist weiß being in German, which in this case is the object language. English is being taken as the meta language. So Schnee ist weiß is true if and only if snow is white as a sentence in English, but it's giving us the meaning through specifying the truth conditions of a sentence in German. We could easily have snow is white in scare quotes is true if and only if snow is white. And that would be to take English as both the object language and the meta language. There's no formal reason why we can't do that. All we need is for the meta language to be at least as rich as is the object language, so that the object language can fit inside the meta language, as it were, and it can do that even if the boundaries of the two are the same. And Davidson argues that theorems like that match exactly the form of what are called T sentences as developed by the Polish logician Alfred Tarski. And his T sentences have the form S is true if and only if P. I've added in L there because always this is indexed to a language. So S is true if and only if P. And so the model that Davidson suggests for a theory of meaning is a Tarskian theory of truth. Now, Tarski had developed his theory of truth already previously, quite long before Davidson developed his theory of meaning. And Tarski's theory of truth is an attempt to provide a model that will give us a formal analysis of the truth predicate as it operates in any specific language. And it does this extensionally. It does it by specifying for every instance of the truth predicate, or every instance in which the truth predicate is used, a corresponding set of conditions that essentially spell out the truth conditions for that sentence. And what Tarski does is use meaning to get at truth. Davidson's doing it the other way around, using truth to get at meaning. Tarski's using meaning to get at truth because he takes sameness of meaning to be what enables him to match a sentence with its truth conditions. David's going to use sameness of truth conditions to match sentences with their meaning. Now this model the Davidsonian project in semantics, which is based around the use of a Tarskian truth theory as the base of the model for a theory of meaning, was incredibly important and influential in the 1970s. It generated the so-called Davidsonian research program in semantics, which took the form of attempts to model, to provide theoretical frameworks or elaborations of all aspects of language use, all aspects of semantic theory, for modeling different forms of speech and so on and so forth. And Davidson has wrote a great deal about how one can use the Tarskian model in order to elaborate different aspects of semantic theory. One of the interesting things about Davidson's approach, of course, is that it depends on taking as primary, essentially, asatoric sentences as the main building blocks of any language. And Davidson believed that asatoric sentences were, in fact, the primary forms of utterance, the primary linguistic elements, as it were. And he argues that every other linguistic form, promises and so on, can always be analysed back to some underlying asatoric expression. That turns out to be important for Davidson. Similarly, it's also important for Davidson to recognise that meaning really arises only in the context of a sentence, that is an assertion. And if you like, this is another version of the holism as well as the compositionality commitment that Davidson has. Meaning does not attach to single words for Davidson. It only attaches to assertions, because only assertions connect to the world, only assertions have truth conditions. This is going to be important later on when we talk about truth, but for the moment, all I want you to do is notice the fact that it is a claim that Davidson makes, and it's tied up with this Tarskian approach to truth. Now, I realise I'm over my 45 minutes, but I've just got one other topic that I want to quickly cover, and that is Davidson's work in the philosophy of mind. This is an area where, in some ways, you might argue that Davidson's position in philosophy of mind is more discussed still now, perhaps, than some of his work in the theory of meaning or in philosophy of action, although it's also been quite controversial. So in a very famous paper in 1970, Davidson develops a paper called Mental Events. Davidson develops a position that he calls anomalous monism. Anomalous monism is really the view that mental events are identical with physical events. They are physical events, much in the same way that reasons are causes. You can see an echo of the earlier paper in this paper, but they aren't simply reducible to them. And again, this is almost a more elaborate view, or an elaboration of the view that he started to set out in actions, reasons, and causes, because there, of course, reasons were the same as causes, but they weren't simply identical with causes. Anomalous monism really depends on three claims which Davidson thinks you can hold together. The first is what he calls the principle of causal interaction, that at least some mental events interact causally with physical events, i.e., example, that my belief that taking vitamin C will stop me getting a cold is directly connected with my taking vitamin C every morning. Okay, the mental event, my holding the belief that, seems to interact with a physical event, that is the action of my picking up a tablet and putting it in my mouth and swallowing it. So that's the principle of causal interaction. The second is that events related as cause or effect, cause and effect fall under strict laws. And that's the principle of the nomological character of causality. And the third is that there are no strict laws relating mental and physical events, the anomalous character of the mental. So this meant Davidson, the use of these, the combination of these three principles or these three ideas is interesting because, of course, it seems as if 1 and 2 are incompatible with one another. 3 is really the attempt to provide a certain sort of reconciliation between them by allowing that in the case of mental and physical events, the relationship, the interaction between those events is not an interaction that falls under a strict law. It's anomalous, Davidson will say. Now, Davidson actually uses anomalous because he treats it as a combination of the privative, the A, and nomos, no law. In fact, that's an incorrect derivation of anomaly as a term, but the point is still the same. Now, that means that mental events and physical events aren't connected as types. They're connected only as tokens. And so Davidson's position is sometimes treated or presented as a token identity theory. So a particular mental event is identical with a particular physical event, but it's a token identity. That is an identity that holds just for those particular events. It's not a type identity. It doesn't hold for all events of that type or of that specific type, which is why there are no strict laws. Now, Davidson's anomalous monism is very often associated with the idea that the idea in the philosophy of mind that the mental is supervenient on the physical. Supervenience is a term that's used to describe the relation between different sets of predicates or different sets of descriptive terms, sometimes between the entities themselves, according to which the supervening predicate can only vary, can only change if there's a change in the subvenient predicate, that is the underlying predicate. So for instance, and that means that you can have a creature, an agent or a speaker who has different physical states, and yet the mental states across those different physical states are the same. This is an issue that became quite important in the development of modern functionalism, which developed out of earlier materialist or identity theory positions, and which depended on the observation that, well, it's quite possible that one might have two creatures, each of which have radically different body structures and body chemistries, and yet they could both be said to be in similar mental states. So you might be a Martian and you might be a human being, but you could both feel pain, even though maybe the Martian's body, the Martian's brain is made up of something completely different from the brain of the human being. Now that idea, which really leads to understanding mental states as functional states, is one of the things that you can see as driving Davidson's anomalous monism. Davidson's not a functionalist because he doesn't define mental states purely in terms of function, but his anomalous monism allows for the supervenience of mental states on physical states without their strict or straightforward reducibility. And that means that Davidson thinks that if you like, the vocabulary of the mental, which he treats as identical with the vocabulary of the rational, as it were, sits on top of the vocabulary that applies to the physical, the language of science, of physical science. It's not disconnected from it, but it's not identical with it either. And that's quite an important position because it enables one, on the basis of Davidson's thinking, to think about, let's say, the language of the social sciences or the language of the humanities and the connections that those disciplines might want to develop, to think of them in ways that do not give priority to a reductionist physicalist position. And that's going to be quite important. Now, so what I've done there is really just take you through three elements in the work of the early Davidson. There's one thing that I've left out, and that's what I referred to briefly earlier, which is the idea of radical interpretation. But I think I want to hold that off until the next lecture. Radical interpretation will introduce a more explicitly hermeneutic element into Davidson's work, but it will also enable us to see how some of these different ideas, anomalous monism, the idea of rationality and the idea of rational explanation as a species of causal explanation, but also, and particularly, the ideas around the theory of meaning and the relation between meaning and truth, how all of these ideas get brought together. Because in in many ways, what happens in Davidson's account of radical interpretation is that what one finds are ideas from Quine, from whom Davidson gets the connection between belief and meaning, from Tarski, from whom Davidson gets the idea of a connection between truth and meaning, and from Frank Ramsey, who I haven't really talked about so far, but who's a key figure in the development of probability theory and decision theory, which Davidson was working on very early on, and for whom the connection is developed between meaning, between belief and desire. These three sets, which connect belief, meaning, truth, and desire, these three sets of dualities, if you like, or combinations, are what really come together in a very interesting way within the structure of radical interpretation. And that then has epistemological implications for Davidson. It has some interesting ontological implications in my view as well. And it sets Davidson on a path towards what I think is a certain sort of convergence with the work of Hans-Georg Gaudinger in particular, but also in the direction of what I think of, as I've said before, a more topological understanding of human being, of meaning, of truth, and of many of the concepts that I've been talking about this evening, or this morning, I guess, for you guys, maybe this afternoon, I'm not quite sure. So I've probably talked for almost an hour there, which is a bit more than I told Emil I would talk for. And I haven't gone into a lot of detail. Particularly, there are a lot of formal details around the theory of truth that we could have discussed. If you want to look at more of the detail, then I would recommend that you have a look at the article on Donald Davidson in the Stanford Encyclopedia, which is readily available online, and which I should admit I wrote. And that will set out what I've been talking about just now in much more detail. And it will also include some of the other material that I'm going to be talking about, particularly in the next lecture. So Emil, if that's okay with you, I think I will stop talking for a bit and get some questions and responses and reactions, if that's all right with you.
Yes, that's fine. You can hear me clearly?
Yeah, I can. And I'll just stop screen sharing as well.
Okay.
Hang on. No, I've forgotten. Oh, there we go. I always forget where the stop share button is.
I have a question.
So I'm open to questions.
Okay, so I won't mediate between questions, so I'll just get whoever to ask a question, and then you can respond, and then we'll follow through with question after question. So you have the first one?
Yeah, but it's a pretty long one, so I think we must go.
And can I ask everyone to speak clearly and loudly, because I'm so deaf that I'm getting a cochlear implant next month. So, you know, if I don't understand your question first off, it's not your fault. It's because of my terrible hearing.
It'll only be us that's unclear because we have one microphone amongst our class, but whoever's on the internet might actually be a lot clearer. So the first one's from the class.
Hi, my name is Harley. I'm not sure if I understood the theory of meaning correctly, so if I didn't, I'm apologizing in advance. But to me, it seemed like there were some very weird parallels with like Kantian morality, in a way that it seems to propose certain objective statements into something that would be that would predetermine later observations, but with the same practical problems as Kantian morality. So it introduces an idea that we have some presupposed true statements from which all later statements would derive, and these statements would create meaning as opposed to them being dependent on meaning. And I have a practical problem with this in mind, because in having to depend on this kind of model, we would need to, first of all, somehow implement it. And it works in theory. I understand the idea that we can derive meaning from statements, even nonsensical statements for the fact, and that meaning could be later proposed as going forward. But if we have to precisely pinpoint the statements from which later meaning could derive, there is a I guess the problem again with rationality, with the fact that there are interpretations that, with their reasonable interpretations that are dependent on our beliefs, our narratives, and so such. So, and is there a way to properly? What?
Yeah. So
I know somebody would just to state the proper question. Is there a way to circumvent this practical problem of pinpointing the statements from which later reasoning can be derived from?
okay, so there are a few things to say about that. First of all, I would just make the comment that there is a strong Kantian element in Davidson's thinking generally, not specifically in the theory of meaning, but Davidson. I mean, I wrote a paper on Davidson and Kant, and when Davidson read it, he said to me afterwards that he hadn't realized how much Kant there was in his work, but he wasn't surprised given how much Kant he'd read. So there is a strong Kantian background, but it's less the Kant of the ethical theory, and much more the Kant of probably the critique of pure reason more than anything, first critique rather than the second. So that's just a very general comment about the relation between Kant and Davidson. I'm not sure I quite follow the analogy you want to make between Davidson's semantic theory and Kant's practical ethic, or Kant's practical philosophy. A few things to remember about Davidson's semantic project. Remember, he's looking for an analysis of what meaning is. Now, meaning historically within philosophy has been a very unclear concept. Davidson's focused on linguistic meaning. In fact, he thinks that linguistic meaning is the only real sense of meaning we can make sense of, but we use meaning more generally, but we can give a clear account of what linguistic meaning is. His approach in the early work using Tarski is to try and provide a formal account of the way in which meaning operates in a language, and to do so extensionally, which means what he's doing is that for each sentence in the language, he is specifying the truth conditions. Okay, that's all. It's a formal account. It doesn't, in one sense, it doesn't operate on the basis of assuming certain sentences are true. It just operates on the basis that this is the sentence whose meaning we want to know, and these are the truth conditions that are matched with that sentence. So it's a purely formal analysis, and it operates in exactly the same way the Tarski analysis does. Now, there are a couple of problems. One is that Tarski's analysis is applied to formal languages. Davidson's analysis is applied to natural languages. Tarski himself said in his theory of truth that it could not be applied to natural languages because they were not formal. That is, they're not well defined. Davidson accepts that and agrees that, therefore, his semantic theory will fail a certain sort of requirement of formalism. It won't be precise. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there's a problem that the theory faces independently of the Tarskian point, and this may be relevant to what you're saying, I'm not sure, and that is that because this is purely truth conditional, because you've just got an if and only if operator there, so snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. You just need sentences like that. In the absence of any other constraint, snow is white is true will have the same truth equivalence or the same truth value as the sentence snow is white and grass is green, but it won't have the same meaning. Now so one of the first criticisms of Davidson's account was that it's not going to rule out sentences in which the truth value doesn't change, but intuitively we want to say the meaning does. Now, two things rule that out in Davidson's theory. First is the requirement of compositionality. That is, the sentence structure has to be explicit. It means that the sentence has to show, if you like, the way in which it is composed out of its parts. Given the requirement of compositionality, you can't just produce any sentence, even if the truth values are the same. And so the formal requirements that Tarski gives us constrain what sort of sentences can appear on the right-hand side of a T sentence. The second way in which Davidson tries to address this is to say that not only are there formal constraints on the right-hand side of a T sentence, there are also empirical constraints. And that's actually where radical interpretation comes in. And I suspect, I'm not sure, that some of what you're asking about is going to relate much more to radical interpretation. Radical interpretation forces us to start looking at the way in which the theory of meaning has to be embedded in actual context of communication and interpretation. And it has to relate linguistic behavior to a whole range of other behaviors. And at that point, you start to have to think about this in much more, maybe in your terms, practical ways. So now I've got no idea whether that really addresses the problem that you had in mind. You know, if I was just to comment on that, I'd say don't make the connection to Davidson's practical philosophy, because I'm not sure that that's really holding. But maybe there is a connection, and maybe the connection is one that really takes us in the direction of radical interpretation. And interestingly, radical interpretation does start to connect us up with questions in ethics, partly through the way in which the principle of charity operates, which I haven't talked about yet, but we'll talk about in the next lecture, and partly through the way in which, if you like, linguistic communication seems to presuppose a level of agreement on a whole range of issues, which might well include ethical issues as well. That's the sort of the principle of charity as well, I guess. But does that help at all?
That was aggressive. It almost does, but there is one thing that you haven't talked about, which I mentioned, is the idea that this kind of logical approach to reason implies that we need to somehow decide upon the truth that we imbibe into.
But no, Davidson, that's not required. The formal analysis doesn't require that. Tarski's analysis doesn't require that. I mean, the only truths that you need to have are truths that might be relevant to the understanding of the meta-language, right? So you need a meta-language first of all. So you need to know how to use the meta-language. And that, you might say, means that you have to know certain truths about the meta-language. That starts getting a little bit complicated at that stage. This is going to be important when Davidson gives us a theory of truth, which he does do, which I'm going to talk about next time, because David's going to say that any account you give of truth already has to presuppose your understanding of what truth is. And that's getting a little bit closer to what you're talking about, I think. But a purely formal semantic theory doesn't require you first to identify what the truths are. Remember, those T sentences are if and only if sentences, right? So they're conditionals. In fact, they're biconditionals, hence the if and only if. Because they're conditionals, they're not making any truth claim themselves, other than a truth claim about what the truth conditions are. But they're not, as it were, making a claim about the truth values necessarily. All you need is equivalence of putative truth values. So snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. Okay? It's a conditional. That's really important.
Okay, I'll get Dennis to ask a question because he's got his hand up.
Yeah, I can see. Hi, Dennis.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you for your talk. So I was wondering if you could answer me, well, what's your position is on the following. So recently I stumbled upon a comment made by Timothy Williamson about Davidson's influence, right? Perhaps it's a wide-known thing that he said that, or like that he holds this position. So yeah, he meant that Davidson's influence on the debates within the analytic tradition were kind of harmful, right? Because according to Williamson, Davidson, well, has made things more enigmatic or mysterious, right? So that he somehow obscured the debates or like something of this kind. So I don't remember that he'd given Williamson, that is, well, an explicit comment on what exactly he meant, right? But so what do you think about that? So how do you think, is this
Well,
correct or like?
I'm not familiar with the specific comment that you refer to. One of the things about and this is again touching on stuff that we're going to talk about next time and the time after particularly. So early Davidson, that is the Davidson of truth and meaning, the Davidson of actions, reasons and causes, the Davidson of mental events. The early Davidson is is often considered to be the archetypal analytic philosopher. His essays are very precise, very carefully constructed. He's dealing with making standard sorts of analytic moves. I mean, he does it much more brilliantly, I think, than most other analytic thinkers, other than perhaps someone like Quine. And in those days, I think Davidson was seen as not in the least making things more mysterious. Maybe we get a hint of that with mental events, but actually as being somebody who was doing analytic philosophy in the way analytic philosophy ought to be done. But things change. So in the 1980s in particular, and into the 1990s, Davidson produces a number of papers which have become almost notorious. So one of the most famous probably is a nice arrangement of epitaphs, in which Davidson seems to recant on his earlier views and argues that there is no such thing as a language. Okay, and that languages are not understood by the operation of any theory, that there is no theory of meaning in a sense. Now I'm going to suggest to you when I talk about this next time that account in a nice arrangement, which has become, as I say, a notorious paper, is entirely consistent with Davidson's earlier work, with a few slight shifts. But it's one of the things that has made some philosophers, analytic philosophers, think that Davidson has sort of turned against analytic philosophy in a way. No one ever makes exactly that complaint, but that Davidson really goes out off the edge. Maybe there was a little bit of concern with Davidson in his semantic theory. I remember, I don't know if any of you have ever come across something called the Philosopher's Dictionary. It was something Dan Dennett put together probably in the 70s and included lots of terms. It included the term Heidegger, which is defined by Dennett as a ponderous device used to bore through many layers of substance. Okay, he also has another term, a Dreyfus. A Dreyfus is a silly philosophical argument about nothing very much at all. And he also gives as an example, actually there's a sort of appendix to the philosophical dictionary in which he caricatures various styles of philosophical argument. And one of them is the Davidson argument for identifying meaning with truth conditions. It's, let us make the bold conjecture that P, therefore P. Okay, these are philosophy jokes, by the way. So Davidson was thought to be somebody who sometimes did make these rather bold moves that often didn't have as much argument behind them as they should. But that wasn't seen as a terribly big problem in the 70s. It was only when Davidson started making claims about there not being such a thing as a language, or his rejection of skepticism, or his argument that there was no such thing as a theory of truth. That is, that truth was a primitive concept and wasn't capable of further elucidation. It's then that Davidson started to be seen as maybe going somewhere a little bit strange. I mean, similarly with Davidson's position on externalism, his rejection of standard accounts of first-person authority. So by the 90s, which is when I was writing most of my work on Davidson, and I was writing stuff on Davidson as a hermeneutic philosopher and connecting Davidson with Gunnerman, I would give papers, particularly actually, I remember one instance where I gave a paper in Uppsala. I think it was Uppsala, maybe it's Stockholm. And there was an analytic philosopher present, whose name I won't mention, who got furious because I was connecting Davidson with Gadamer, and Davidson would never countenance such a connection. And the holism that I was attributing to Davidson had to be false because holism led to idealism, and Davidson was not an idealist. Now, all of this was stuff I talked to Don about. You know, Don wrote, he and Gadamer engaged, they corresponded in the 90s. So, and this is why Gadamer asked Davidson to contribute to his Library of Living Philosophers volume. Holism was something Davidson and I talked about a great deal. But amongst some analytic philosophers, there were certain directions in which Davidson seemed to go, or in which commentators like me wanted to take him, that were seen as completely beyond the pale. And Don didn't care by that stage. So by the mid to late 90s, Don couldn't be dismissed because he was too big a name. But equally, people didn't necessarily take him seriously. So he was a little bit on the edges. And he was quite happy about that. Remember too, Davidson's closest philosophical friend was Dick Rorty. And Dick always used to say he was essentially a Davidsonian. He endorsed all of Davidson's positions. There was one notable exception, and that is the role of truth. Davidson, when Rorty applied for the job at Stanford, which he held till the end of his life, it was Don who wrote the reference form. So Davidson and Rorty were very close together, held very similar views. Rorty, of course, was considered as something of a pariah by the philosophical analytic establishment. Davidson wasn't, but only because he couldn't be regarded that way, because the work he had done in the 60s and 70s was so pivotal and so important, and because Davidson was so close to Quine. So to abandon Davidson would be to abandon Quine almost. So, yeah, there's some point to what you're saying, and it reflects a common view of the way in which Davidson is often read among core analytic thinkers. And it does indicate the radicality, I think, of Davidson's thinking. Davidson is an analytic philosopher who forces analytic philosophy to rethink its basic presuppositions. And if that heads in the direction of what some analytic philosophers think is mysticism or then all the better for it. And, you know, these are some of the reasons why I think Davidson and Heidegger can be connected and compared in useful ways. So,
excellent.
Yeah, thank you.
Any of you guys? Anyone? Roman?
No.
Anyone from the internet?
Maybe I have.
Hello. Okay.
Please have a seat.
Just
Actually,
a word.
Joe, you go.
Sorry. Yes. Well, I just want to thank you very much. This is a very wonderful thing to be able to tune in to Davidson at first hand, Davidson and tap, as it were. I only know very little about. I read some of his early essays, the one on the very idea of a conceptual scheme. But
yeah,
a bit like our friend Dennis, he seemed to me very mysterious as well. But that's because I'm not. You have to know the context, and why would such an essay, any essay by Davidson, be revolutionary, be enlightening, be important advance, is something I can't discern. I don't know the context sufficiently. But listening to you, I probably will. And now I've discovered there's 15 books on Davidson in our library, including your own dialogues with Davidson, which I might be able to read with your help. And thank you very much.
Hope so. I mean, it's good to see you, Joe, by the way. I mean, what I tried to do in the Stanford Encyclopedia piece is to make the Davidsonian material more accessible. And mentioning on the very idea of a conceptual scheme, that's another of these notorious essays that the later Davidson writes. In fact, that's probably the first of these, where Davidson is seen as holding a position, but it's just impossible. How can you deny that there's such a thing as a conceptual scheme? In fact, what Davidson is doing in that essay is something very similar to what Heidegger does. He's rejecting the idea that we can think about our relationship to the world as a relationship between language or subjectivity on the one hand and objectivity on the other. Davidson holds to something very like Heidegger's being in the world. He just works that out in a different way. And that's what I'll talk about in the next couple of lectures. But I think it's those aspects of Davidson that make Davidson seem mysterious to some. The other reason Davidson is mysterious is because Davidson's writing was almost all, as I said, in the form of essays, but it can only be read. It can't be read piecemeal. So most people like you have read one or two Davidson essays or a few more. That doesn't give you enough. I mean, that's a bit like reading, you know, building, dwelling, thinking, maybe what is metaphysics, you know, 3 or 4 Heidegger essays and trying to get a sense of the whole. So Davidson doesn't write a single book that brings it all together, unlike Heidegger. And so when one reads Davidson, you're always trying to put it together on the basis of these small essays. And my feeling has always been you really have to work through Davidson's thinking as a whole, because it is systematic, even though it's not presented in systematic fashion. And that's a barrier for many people. And that's another of the ways in which he's not really an analytic thinker. Analytic thinkers like to write these short essays in which everything's included in the essay. There's a bit of that in Davidson, but only if you know all of the other stuff that Don's including underneath the surface. So he's mysterious in that he's a very, very difficult writer to engage with because the writing is incredibly dense. Don used to work over those essays at great length. And there's seldom a word out of place. But you need to know a lot more. You need to know, as you say, a much wider context in order to be able to see what's going on.
Good. Thanks.
Okay. Yes.
If we have time.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. I was interested in this idea of this relation between object languages and meta languages, and I was interested. Maybe 2 questions. Like, if they say, like in the context that you said, there was like early Davidson and like later Davidson. So is this idea persist? Does he like in his thinking like that there is some meta languages that can actually include these object languages, that this translation is possible between them? And my second question is like related, like what can be this meta language and like how can we define it? Because at some point you kind of said that if the meta language can be rich enough to kind of allow the object languages to be translated.
Yeah, so the distinction between object and meta language is purely formal. All that's required to have a meta language is that you have a language whose semantic resources are at least as great as the resources of the object language. Okay, so you can, and it's almost purely stipulative. So you can take German as your object language, or Russian as your object. You could take Russian as your object language and German as your meta language. You could take Russian as your object language and Russian as your meta language. Right. So the distinction is a purely formal one. Okay, it's simply the way in which these two structures are operating. I mean, the reason this distinction is made in tasking is because Tarski needs to have a way of talking about, if he's going to give a theory of truth for a language, he needs to have a way of talking about that language, namely the object language. And to talk about the object language, he needs another language in which to do it. Okay, and that's the meta language. They can be the same languages in reality, but formally they can be distinguished. In Tarski, this becomes especially important because Tarski is one of the things that concerns Tarski are problems around the truth predicate, and in particular the so-called semantic paradoxes. Okay, now all the semantic paradoxes, the truth paradoxes, come about because we try to use the truth predicate self-referentially. And you will know lots of examples of this. The famous example of Cretan, the Cretan Epimenides, who says to you, I'm a Cretan. All Cretans are liars. Is what he says true or false? Well, it's you can't make sense of it. Or the page of a sheet of paper which has written on one side, the sentence on the other side of this page is false. You turn it over and there's a sentence which says the sentence on the other side of this page is true. Now, these paradoxes come about because of self-referential uses of the truth predicate. So what the meta-language, object language distinction enables Karski to do is artificially, you might say, separate off, talk about truth so that you can talk about the truth predicate without getting involved in paradox. Because you've got the truth predicate as it's operating in the object language and the truth predicate as it operates in the meta language. And you're not contradicting yourself. You don't get involved in these straightforward inconsistencies. And as soon as you want to talk about truth, you need something like the formal distinction of object language from meta language, right? You might say that any attempt to, you can also see how this is a sort of way of trying to resolve the Gödel problem, the problem of consistency proofs, right? If you've got an object level to a meta level to move to, and you can take the system that you're focused on as the object system, then you can sort of prove things within that about that system from the point of view of the larger system. But the idea is basically just that if you want to talk about that system as a whole, you have to move to a higher level. You have to move to another system within which the first system is embedded. So it's not as if there's a question about whether there are meta languages. There are as many meta languages as we want to create, as we want to establish. This is a purely artificial conceit, if you like. It's a formal device in order to enable us to do the work that we want to do on these more constrained objects. In one sense, there are no meta languages as well, because the ultimate meta language would be the world. But the world is also going to be the object language, or the object that we're focused on. And so there's no other place to go to try and take the entirety of the world as an object, other than from within the world. At that point, we start to see that there are some other interesting questions here about self-referentiality as such, and about the possibility of being able to address philosophical questions, which have always been questions about the world. Okay? This is, leaving aside Tarski, this is now the problem that we can see in Kant, where Kant wants to ask about how we can justify our knowledge when we have nowhere outside that we can appeal to in order to develop or provide that justification. Okay, this is the problem of critical philosophy. And Kant resolves that problem through the notion of the transcendental, which the interpretation of which is another topic that we could talk on for some length, at some length. But so the object meta language distinction on one level is a really simple distinction. You can simply deploy it with respect to any language, and you can use any other language. So certainly in the case of natural languages, it's more complicated with formal languages, because formal languages have constraints. At another level, the problem that's at issue there, namely the problem of self-referentiality, which is especially problematic in relation to truth, is indicative of a much deeper problem that affects philosophy as a whole. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that next time. Does that help?
Yes.
Or does it just confuse? I'm not sure.
Actually, it's clarified like this relation between meta language and object language. And the secondly, yeah, it showed me like two more problems in the philosophy.
Yeah. But look, all you need to understand the distinction between meta language and object language is just this idea, or all you need to establish a meta language is you just need to be able to specify a language whose resources are at least as great as the resources of the object language. And that's necessarily true for any language, because any language will have resources that are as great as that very language. So if you artificially take the same language as both object language and meta language, then the distinction will work, and you'll be able to use that language as meta language for itself, right? That's just reflexivity, if you like. Okay.
Okay, we got time for one more. We'll take George's question.
Hi, George.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. My question is about mental events and anomalous monism in the philosophy of mind. Maybe my question is only about labels, but anyway, as far as I understand it, or maybe I made it up, but Davidson follows Lewis's idea that there are only causal explanations. And if as you said it, there are no strict laws relating mental and physical events. Does the principle of causal closure then hold? And so it seems that such a position is also similar at the same time to both physicalistic theories like identity theory or functionalism. But also to some overdetermination type of dualism, or perhaps since there is some anomalous area in the mental area is anomalous, such a position is partly Mysterian. What might actually constitute an anomaly area? What is anomaly area actually? I don't quite understand it, and so, but maybe it's probably closer to pure physicalism.
Yeah, so Davidson's position is an interesting one. So Davidson regarded himself as a materialist. Okay, I think of myself as a materialist as well. It's just that Davidson didn't think that the vocabulary of materialism was the only vocabulary we have to use. So he doesn't think that the materialist vocabulary supplants every other vocabulary. And so he thinks that there is a vocabulary of the material, but there's also a vocabulary that applies, that is the vocabulary of the rational. Causality is something that he doesn't think operates only at the level of the material in one sense. So he has a paper called, oh no, which paper is it? There's a late paper on the specific topic that talks about these problems and makes very clear that he doesn't regard the causal level as applying only, let's say, to the physicalist level of description. He thinks causal relations can obtain between mental events, between physical events, between mental and physical events. What's anomalous about Davidson about this is that Davidson doesn't think there are strict laws. That's it. Now, lots of people think this is not a coherent position. Somebody like Jae-Gwon Kim has argued that Davidson's position ends up being a form of epiphenomenalism, because he thinks that there's got to be something like what you were calling overdetermination, or at least that the mental events end up being mere epiphenomena that don't have genuine causal efficacy. Now, Davidson disputes that. There's a whole literature around this question about how we should understand anomalous monism, or how we should understand supervenience generally. You might argue that epiphenomenalism becomes an issue for some, maybe even for some functionalist accounts. Davidson's position is similar to functionalism in some ways. But I guess I would think of Davidson as also being different from most functionalists, in that he's not primarily wanting to think of mental states as just functional states. And he does hold to this idea of what we might think of as a plurality of descriptive vocabularies that can be adequate to the phenomenon. of which the materialist vocabulary is only one. But, you know, I mean, some of this is, as you say, maybe a question about labels. Some of it does relate to more substantive questions, but you've really got to look at the particular positions at issue and then, you know, be able to try and work it out in more precise detail. It's a bit hard to respond to in generalities. For myself, I tend to think of anomalous monism as consisting in this idea that there are lots of different ways of describing the world. And they all describe the same world, but the descriptions are different. Interestingly, this relates to another claim that Davidson makes, which is about the nature of, about ontology, really. So Davidson thinks that the fundamental things are events, although he acknowledges that any event ontology can be transformed into an object ontology through forms of redescription. And he also thinks that events are particulars. And because they're particulars, they can support more than one description. This is why I emphasize that Anscombe, that idea from Anscombe about events, about actions under a description. So Davidson thinks that particular entities, particular events, always support more than one description, which is equally true, which can be equally true. So you've got a monism of events. What there is just this one sort of thing, just these events. But they're amenable to lots of different descriptions. So they're indeterminate between different descriptions. And if you like, maybe that's what we could regard as the real source of the anomaly, because that's one of the reasons why you can't get strict laws. Does that help at all?
Yes, thank you. And also good evening, maybe to you, not good morning.
Yeah, well, good morning to you, good evening to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Jeff, for that. Thanks, everybody, for joining the talk. And I think we'll call it there. I'll stop the recording now.
Yeah, I'll call it a night. And do we convene again next week at the same time, same place, same back channel?
Yes, we do. Jeff, I'll stop the recording now. We can do just 1 minute talk.
Yeah.